The BFG had made thousands of journeys to and from giant country over the years, but he'd never in his life made one quite like this, with 9 huge helicopters roaring along just over his head. He'd never travelled before in broad daylight either. He just hadn't dared to. But this was different, now that he was doing it for the Queen of England herself, and he was frightened of nobody. As he galloped across the British Isles with the helicopters thundering above him, people stood and gaped and wondered what on earth was going on. Just show you a picture. They would have never seen anything like this before, and they never would again. Every now and again, the pilots of the helicopters would catch a glimpse of a small girl wearing glasses crouching in the giant's right ear and waving to them. They always waved back. The pilots marvelled at the giant's speed and at the way that he leaped across wide rivers and over huge houses. But they hadn't seen anything yet. "Be careful to hang on tight," the BFG said. "We is going as fast as a fizzle-crump." The BFG changed into his famous top gear, and all at once he began to fly forwards as though there were springs in his legs and rockets in his toes. He went skimming over the earth just like a magical hop-skip-jumper, with his feet hardly ever touching the ground. As usual, Sophie had to crouch low in the crevice of his ear to save herself from being swept clean away. The 9 pilots in their helicopters suddenly realised that they were being left behind. The giant was streaking ahead. They opened their throttles up to full speed, and even then they were only just able to keep up. In the leading machine, the head of the Air Force was sitting beside the pilots. He had a world atlas on his knees, and he kept staring first at the atlas, then at the ground below, trying to figure out where on earth they were going. Frantically, he turned the pages of the atlas. Where are we going?" he cried. "I haven't actually the foggiest idea," the pilot answered. "The Queen's orders were to follow the giant, and that's exactly what I'm doing." The pilot was a young Air Force officer with a bushy moustache, and he was very proud of his moustache. He was also quite fearless, and he loved adventure. He thought this was a super adventure. "It's going to be fun to go to new places," he said. "New places?" shouted the head of the Air Force. "What the blazes do you mean, new places?" "This place where we're flying over now isn't in the atlas, is it?" the pilot said, grinning. "You're darn right it isn't in the atlas," cried the head of the Air Force. "We've flown clear off the last page." "Oh, well, I expect the old giant knows where he's going," said the young pilot. Ooh. "He's leading us into disaster," cried the head of the Air Force. He was shaking with fear. In the seat behind him sat the head of the army, who was just as much terrified. "You don't mean to tell me we've gone right out of the atlas," he cried, leaning forward to look. "That's exactly what I am telling you," cried the Air Force man. "Look for yourself. Here's the very last map and the whole flaming atlas. We went off that over an hour ago." He turned the page. As in all atlases, there were 2 completely blank pages at the end. "So now we must be somewhere about here," he said, putting a finger on the blank pages. "Where's here?" cried the head of the army. The young pilot was still grinning broadly. He said to them, "That's why they always put 2 blank pages at the end of the atlas. They're for new countries. You're meant to fill them in yourself." The head of the Air Force glanced down at the ground below. "Just look at this godforsaken desert," he cried. "All the trees are dead, all the rocks are blue." "The giant stopped," the young pilot said. "He's waving us down." The pilots throttled back the engines and all 9 helicopters landed safely on the great yellow wasteland. Then each of them lowered the ramp from its belly. 9 jeeps, 1 from each helicopter, were driven down the ramps. Each jeep contained 6 soldiers and a vast quantity of thick rope and heavy chains. "I don't see any giants," the head of the army said. "The giant is all just out of sight over there," the BFG told him. "But if you take in these sloshbuckling, noisy belly poppers any closer, all the giants is waking up at once, and then pop goes the weasel." "So you want us to proceed by jeep?" the head of the army said. "Yes," the BFG said, "but you must all be very, very hushy quiet. No roaring of motors, no shouting, no mucking about, no piggery-jokery." The BFG, still with Sophie in his ear, trotted forward, and the jeeps followed close behind. Suddenly, the most dreadful rumbling noise was heard by everyone. The head of the army went pea-green in the face. "Those are guns," he said. "There's a battle raging somewhere up ahead of us. Turn back, you lot. Let's get out of here." "Oh, pig's piffle," the BFG said. "Those noises are not guns. Of course they're guns, shouted the head of the army. I'm a military man and I know a gun when I hear one. Turn back now. Oh, no. Those is just the giants snortling in their sleep, the BFG said. I is a giant myself, and I know a giant snortle when I hear one. Are you quite sure? The army man said anxiously. Positive, the BFG said. Well, proceed cautiously, the army man ordered. They all moved on. Then they saw them. Even at a distance, they were enough to scare the daylights out of the soldiers. But when they got close and saw what the giants really looked like, they began to sweat with fear. 9 fearsome, ugly, half-naked, 50 feet long brutes lay sprawled over the ground in various grotesque attitudes of sleep, and the sound of their snoring was indeed like a gunfire battle. The BFG raised his hand, the jeeps all stopped, and the soldiers got out. What happens if one of them wakes up? Whispered the head of the army, his knees knocking together from fear. If any one of them is waking up, he will gobble you down before you can say, Knack jive. The BFG answered, grinning hugely. Me is the only one what won't be gobbled up because the giants is never eating giants. Me and Sophie is only safe because I is hiding her if that happens. The head of the army took several paces to the rear, so did the head of the Air Force. They climbed rather quickly back into their jeep, ready to make fast getaway if necessary. Go forward, men, the head of the army said. Go forward and do your duty bravely. The soldiers crept forward with their ropes and chains, and all of them were trembling mightily. None of them dared speak a word. The BFG, with Sophie now sitting on the palm of his hand, stood nearby and watching the operation. To give the soldiers their due, they were extremely courageous. There were 6 well-trained efficient men working on each giant, and within 10 minutes, 8 out of the 9 giants had been trussed up with like chickens and were still snoring contentedly. The 9th, who happened to be the flesh lump eater, was causing trouble for the soldiers because he was lying with his right arm tucked underneath his enormous body. It was impossible to tie his wrists and arms together without first getting that arm out from underneath him. Very, very cautiously, the 6 soldiers who were working on the flesh lump eater began to pull at the huge arm, trying to release it. The flesh lump eater opened his tiny, piggy, black eyes. Which of you foul pesters is wiggling my arm? He bellowed. Is that you, you rotsome man-hugger? Suddenly, he saw the soldiers, and in a flash he was sitting up and looking around him. He saw more soldiers, and with a roar he leapt to his feet. The soldiers were petrified with fear, and they froze where they were. They had no weapons with them. The head of the army put his jeep into reverse. Human beings, the flesh lump eater yelled. What is all you flush-bunking, rotsome, half-baked beans doing in our country? He made a grab at a soldier and swept him up in his hand. I is having early suppers today, he shouted, holding the poor squirming soldier at arm's length and roaring with laughter. Sophie, standing on the palm of the BFG's hand, was watching horror-struck. Do something, she cried, quick, before she eats him. Put that human being down, the BFG shouted. The flesh lumper turned and stared at the BFG. What is you doing here with all these grotty twiglets? He bellowed. You is making me very suspicious. The BFG made a rush at the flesh lump eater, but the colossal 54-foot-high giant simply knocked him over with a flick of his free arm, and at the same time Sophie fell off the BFG's palm and onto the ground. Her mind was racing. She must do something. She must. She remembered the sapphire brooch the Queen had pinned onto her chest, and quickly she undid it. I is guzzling you nice and slow, the flesh lumper was saying as he had the soldier in his hand. Then I is guzzling 10 or 20 more of you midgy little maggots down there. You is not getting away from me because I is galloping 50 times faster than you. Sophie ran up behind the flesh lump eater. She was holding the brooch between her fingers, and when she was right up to the great naked hairy legs, she rammed the 3-inch long pin of the brooch as hard as she could into the flesh lump eater's right ankle. It went deep into the flesh, and it stayed there. The giant gave a roar of pain and jumped high in the air. He dropped the soldier and made a grab for his ankle. The BFG, knowing what a coward the flesh lump eater was, saw his chance. You was bitten by a snake, he shouted. I seed it biting you. It was frightsome, powerless viper. It was deadly, humongous, dungerous, vinderous sniper. Save our souls, bellowed the flesh lump-eater. Sound the crumpets! I is bitten by a septious venomous Vindscream viper! He flopped to the ground and sat there howling his head off and clutching his ankle with both hands. His fingers felt the brooch. The teeth of the deadly viper is still sticking into me, he yelled. I is feeling the teeth sticking into my ankle. The BFG saw this as his second chance. We must be getting those viper teeth out at once, he cried. Otherwise you is deader than duck soup. I is going to help you. The BFG knelt down beside the flesh lump-eater. You must grab your anklet very tight with both hands, he ordered. That will stop the poisonous juices from venomous viper going up your leg and into your heart. The flesh lump-eater grabbed his ankle with both hands. Now, close your eyes and grittle your teeth and look up to heaven and say your prayers, whilst I is taking out the teeth of the venomous viper, okay? The BFG said. The terrified flesh limper did exactly what he was told. The BFG signalled for some rope and a soldier rushed it over to him. With both flesh lump-eater's hands gripping at his ankle, it was a simple matter for the BFG to tie the ankles and the hands together with a tight knot. I is pulling out the frightsome viper's teeth, the BFG said as he pulled the knot tight. Do it quickly, shouted the flesh lump-eater, before I pizen to death. There he is, said the BFG, standing up. You can look now. When the flesh lump-eater saw that he was trussed up like a turkey, he gave a yell so loud that the heavens trembled. He rolled and he wriggled and he fought and he friggled and he squirmed and he squiggled, but there was nothing he could do. Well done you, Sophie cried. No, well done you, said the BFG, smiling down at the little girl. You saved all of our lives. Will you please get that brooch back for me, though, Sophie said, because it belongs to our queen. The BFG pulled the beautiful brooch out of the flesh lump-eater's ankle. The flesh lump-eater howled, and the BFG wiped the pin and handed it back to Sophie. Curiously, not one of the other 8 snoring giants had woken up during this schmozzle. When you was the only sleeping one, or 2 hours a day, you was sleeping extra deeply, the BFG explained. The head of the army and the Air Force drove forward once again in their jeep. Her Majesty will be very pleased with me, said the head of the army. I should probably get a medal. What's my next move? Now you is all driving over to my cave to load up my bottles of dreams, said the BFG. We can't waste time with that rubbish, the army said. It's the Queen's order, said Sophie. She was now back on the BFG's hand. So the 9 jeeps drove to the BFG's cave and the great dream loading operation began. There were 50,000 jars all to be loaded up more than 5,000 to each jeep, and it took over an hour to finish the job. Whilst the soldiers were loading the dreams, the BFG and Sophie disappeared over the mountains on a mysterious errand. When they came back, the BFG had a sack the size of a small house slung over his shoulder. What's that you've got in there? The head of the army demanded to know. Curiosity. Curiosity is killing the rat, the BFG said, and he turned away from the silly man. When he was sure that all the precious streams had been safely loaded onto the jeeps, the BFG said, Now, we is driving back to the belly poppers and picking up some frightsome giants. The jeep drove back to the helicopters, the 50,000 dreams were carried carefully jar by jar onto the helicopter, and the soldiers climbed back on board. But the BFG and Sophie stayed on the ground. Then they all returned to where the 9 giants were laying. It was a fine sight to see these great air machines hovering over trussed up giants. It was an even finer sight to see the giants being woken up by the terrific thundering of engines overhead. And the finest sight of all was to observe those 9 hideous brutes squirming and twisting all over the ground like a mass of mighty snakes as they tried to free themselves from the ropes and the chains. I is flush-bunkled, roared the flesh lump-eater. I is spilt-swiggled, yelled the child chewer. I is swog-swalloped, bellowed the bone cruncher. I is goose-groogled, howled the man-hugger. I is grun-swipe, shouted the meat dripper. I is flux-gruntled, screamed the maid's hammer. And I is slop-squabbled, squawked the grizzled gulper. I is crod-swinked, yelled the blood bottler. And I is bob-smuggered, screeched the butcher's boy. The 9 giant-carrying helicopters each chose a separate giant and hovered directly over him. Very strong steel horses with hooks at the end of them were lowered to the front and the rear of the helicopter. The BFG quickly secured the hooks to the giants' chains, one hook near the legs and the other near the arms. Then very slowly the giants were winched up into the air, parallel with the ground. The giants roared and bellowed, and there was nothing more that they could do. The BFG, with Sophie once more resting comfortably in his ear, set off at a gallop for England. The helicopters all banked around and followed after him. It was an amazing spectacle, those 9 helicopters wingling through the sky, each with a trussed-up 50-foot long giant slung underneath it. The giants themselves must have found it an interesting experience. They never stopped bellowing, but their howls were drowned out by the noises of the engine. When it began to get dark, the helicopters switched on the powerful searchlights and trained them onto the galloping giant so as to keep them in sight. They flew right through the night and arrived in England just as dawn was breaking. Oh, that was a tricky chapter to read out loud.